The room hummed with anticipation as colleagues, friends, and family gathered in the grand banquet hall to celebrate Dr. Richard Evans' retirement. After 3 decades of impeccable service as a leading cardiologist, Richard's career was finally winding to a ceremonious close. His wife, Margaret, had spent weeks planning the event, ensuring every detail was perfect, from the floral arrangements to the playlist of Richard's favorite jazz standards. As Richard stood at the podium, his signature charm filled the room. He thanked his colleagues, spoke fondly of his patients, and praised Margaret for her unwavering support. "I couldn't have done this without my incredible wife," he said, turning toward her. Margaret beamed, her pride and love evident. Then came the surprise moment of the evening, a video tribute organized by one of Richard's longtime colleagues, Dr. Alan Marsh. A reel of heartfelt messages from former patients, hospital staff, and family members played. Laughter and applause erupted at heartfelt anecdotes and light-hearted jokes. But as the video neared its end, the mood in the room shifted. The final clip featured a young woman in a nurse's uniform, standing in what appeared to be a sunny backyard. She smiled warmly into the camera. "Hi, Richard. Or should I say Dad?" A murmur spread through the crowd. Margaret.
Before I continue, my friends, I kindly ask you to subscribe to my channel. It only takes a second for you, but it's a huge boost of motivation for me to keep creating videos. I'd also greatly appreciate your comments. Thank you for your support. Now, let's get back to the story.
Now that you have more free time, the room erupted into stunned whispers. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched her wine glass. Richard's face turned pale, his composure faltering for the first time that evening. Margaret rose from her seat, her voice low but seething with anger. "Who is she, Richard?" Richard stammered, I can explain." The nurse in the video was Lisa Monroe, a junior nurse who had worked briefly under Richard's supervision 5 years earlier. But as Margaret would soon learn, Lisa had been much more than just a colleague. For nearly a decade, Richard had been living a double life. He had met Lisa while mentoring her at the hospital and began an affair. It wasn't long before she gave birth to a daughter, his daughter. The carefully curated facade of Richard's perfect life crumbled in an instant. Margaret stormed out, followed by murmurs of shock and disbelief from the crowd. The once celebratory atmosphere turned cold as the gravity of the revelation settled over the attendees. Richard was left standing alone at the podium, his reputation tarnished and his family in shambles. The applause he had received moments earlier now seemed a distant memory, replaced by a silence that felt more damning than any words could ever be. The drive home was silent. Margaret gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing with fragments of the evening's revelation. She had left the banquet without waiting for Richard, leaving him to face the aftermath alone. By the time she reached their sprawling suburban home, her emotions oscillated between fury and heartbreak. Hours later, the sound of the garage door opening signaled Richard's return. He entered the house hesitantly, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his secret's exposure. Margaret sat in the dimly lit living room, a glass of wine untouched on the table. Her piercing gaze met his as he stepped into the room. "Start talking," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. Richard sighed, sinking into the armchair across from her. "Margaret, I didn't plan for this to happen. Lisa, she was a mistake. It started after a long shift. I was tired, vulnerable." Margaret cut him off sharply. "Don't insult me with excuses, Richard. You didn't just cheat. You built an entire second life. You had a child." Her voice cracked, betraying the pain behind her anger. For a moment, Richard looked as though he might argue, but he deflated, nodding. "You're right. There's no excuse. I've been selfish." "Selfish?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "You've been living a lie for nearly a decade. Did you ever love us? Or were we just your cover?" "I love you," he said firmly, "and I love our kids. I never wanted to hurt you or them. I thought I could keep things separate." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "Separate? You paraded her in that video, Richard, in front of everyone. Was she supposed to be some kind of retirement gift for you?" "That wasn't my doing," he admitted. "Lisa recorded that on her own. She said she wanted to surprise me, to honor me. I didn't know she'd—" "Save it," Margaret spat, standing abruptly. She walked toward the staircase, pausing only to deliver one final blow. "I don't know who you are anymore, but I know this. You've destroyed this family. If you think we'll survive this, you're delusional." Richard remained in the living room, staring at the empty chair where Margaret had been. The silence of the house felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the vibrant life they once shared within its walls. The fallout was swift and brutal. Margaret confided in their adult children, Emma and Lucas, who reacted with a mixture of disbelief and outrage. Emma refused to speak to her father, while Lucas, the more pragmatic of the two, demanded a full explanation. Richard tried to salvage his relationship with them, but the damage was already done. Margaret, meanwhile, hired a lawyer. Divorce papers were served within weeks, and the once-admired cardiologist found himself battling not just for his assets but for the remnants of his dignity. The scandal spread beyond the family. News of the affair and secret child leaked to the hospital staff, tarnishing Richard's impeccable career. Lisa, now aware of the chaos her video had caused, publicly apologized but was met with mixed reactions. Some sympathized with her as a single mother caught in a complex situation, while others condemned her for participating in the deception. Richard's retirement, meant to be a time of reflection and peace, became a lonely exile. He moved into a modest apartment, far from the home he once shared with Margaret. As he unpacked boxes filled with awards and family photos, he realized that his greatest loss wasn't material. It was the trust and love of the family he had taken for granted. Months later, Margaret sat in a cozy cafe, sipping coffee as the rain drizzled outside. She had filed for divorce and started therapy, determined to rebuild her life. Across the table, Emma and Lucas laughed about a childhood memory, their bond with their mother stronger than ever. For Margaret, this was the first step toward healing. A life free from lies, built on truth and resilience. The courtroom was stark and sterile, its atmosphere heavy with the weight of unspoken resentments and shattered trust. Richard sat at the defendant's table, his once commanding presence diminished to a shadow of itself. Margaret sat across the aisle, her head held high, exuding the quiet strength of someone who had been deeply wronged but was determined to reclaim her dignity. The divorce proceedings had grown contentious, especially when Margaret's lawyer introduced evidence of Richard's financial entanglements with Lisa. Bank statements revealed monthly payments labeled as consultation fees, though they were clearly meant to support Lisa and their daughter. The revelation added fuel to Margaret's case, painting Richard as not only deceitful but also irresponsible with their shared finances. "This isn't just about infidelity, Your Honor," Margaret's lawyer argued. "This is about a betrayal of trust and the misuse of marital assets to sustain a clandestine relationship." Richard's lawyer countered, trying to frame the payments as acts of generosity toward his child rather than malice toward his wife. Dr. Evans acknowledges his mistakes, but his actions were never intended to harm Mrs. Evans or their family. He seeks an amicable resolution. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with decades of experience presiding over family court, observed the sparring lawyers with a keen eye. Her final ruling came after weeks of testimony and deliberation. Margaret would receive a significant portion of their shared assets, including the family home, and Richard was ordered to provide monthly alimony payments. For Richard, it was a crushing blow. He had lost his family, his home, and his reputation. Yet, the worst of it was the cold, distant stares from Emma and Lucas, who had attended the final hearing to support their mother. They refused to acknowledge Richard as he left the courtroom, his shoulders hunched under the weight of their silent judgment. Richard's life settled into a bleak routine. He spent his days volunteering at a free clinic in a desperate attempt to salvage some semblance of purpose. The once respected cardiologist now found himself navigating the humbling realities of a simpler existence. Occasionally, he received text messages from Lisa about their daughter, Emily. While Lisa had distanced herself after the scandal, she allowed Richard limited visitation rights, though their interactions were strained and awkward. One chilly Sunday afternoon, Richard sat on a park bench watching Emily play on the swings. She was a bright-eyed, curious girl who bore an uncanny resemblance to Emma at the same age. For a moment, Richard felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps he could forge a bond with this child, a chance to be better than he had been. But Emily's laughter brought a pang of regret. He realized the depth of what he had sacrificed. The laughter of his own children, the shared dinners, the milestones he would never fully be a part of again. His choices had built a wall, and he now stood on the wrong side of it. Margaret, on the other hand, began to thrive. She enrolled in an art class, something she had always wanted to do but had set aside for Richard's demanding career. Her paintings, often abstract expressions of her journey through pain and renewal, became a therapeutic outlet. Her art teacher noticed her talent and encouraged her to showcase her work at a local gallery. The opening night of Margaret's exhibit was a quiet triumph. Emma and Lucas attended, their pride in their mother evident. For Margaret, it wasn't just about the art. It was about reclaiming her identity, proving to herself that she was more than just Richard's wife. As the gallery buzzed with admiration for her pieces, Margaret stood near one painting titled Fragmented, a chaotic swirl of colors symbolizing her broken past. A young woman approached her, a kind smile on her face. It was Lisa. "I didn't expect to see you here," Margaret said, her tone neutral but guarded. "I wasn't sure if I should come," Lisa admitted. "But I wanted to apologize for everything." Margaret regarded her for a long moment. "It's not me you owe an apology to. It's Emma and Lucas." Lisa nodded, her expression heavy with remorse. "I know. I hope, someday, they'll let me." Margaret's voice softened, though it remained firm. "You're a part of his life now. That's your burden to bear. Just make sure Emily knows she's loved, and make better choices than we did." Lisa's eyes welled with tears, but she nodded and walked away. Margaret turned back to her painting, exhaling deeply. For the first time in a long while, she felt free, not from the past but from its power to define her. She was no longer the betrayed wife of a fallen man. She was Margaret Evans, survivor, artist, and the architect of her own future. Several years passed, and the lives of everyone involved began to settle into new rhythms, though the echoes of the scandal never fully faded. Margaret thrived in her newfound independence. Her art gained recognition beyond her small community, and she even opened her own studio. Emma and Lucas visited often, their bond with her unshakable. Life wasn't perfect, but it was honest, a stark contrast to the web of deceit she had once endured. For Richard, life was a different story. His professional reputation remained tarnished, and though he found solace in his volunteer work, the absence of his family gnawed at him. His visits with Emily, now a precocious 8-year-old, became the highlight of his otherwise monotonous days. She was his lifeline, a symbol of both his mistakes and his chance for redemption. One crisp autumn morning, Richard decided to visit Margaret's gallery unannounced. He had seen her name in an art magazine and read about an upcoming exhibition titled Resilience. Curiosity, mixed with a desperate need for closure, compelled him to see her work in person. The gallery was bustling when Richard arrived, but he hung back, avoiding attention. As he wandered through the space, he was struck by the raw emotion in Margaret's paintings. One piece, titled Fissures, caught his eye, a canvas filled with jagged cracks illuminated by soft golden light. It was hauntingly beautiful, and he couldn't help but feel it symbolized the fragile, fractured connection between them. "Richard," came a familiar voice behind him. He turned to see Margaret, her expression unreadable. She was dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit, her confidence radiating. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said, his voice hesitant. I wanted to see your work." Margaret crossed her arms, studying him for a moment. "You've seen it now. What do you want?" He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I wanted to apologize, not just for the affair, but for everything, for taking you for granted, for the years of lies. I know it's too late, but I needed you to hear it." Margaret's gaze softened, though she remained guarded. "Richard, I've spent years picking up the pieces of the life you broke. I've moved on. Not just from you, but from the person I was when I loved you. That woman wouldn't recognize me now. He nodded, his shoulders slumping. I understand. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I regret it all. Losing you, the kids, everything. There was a long pause as Margaret considered her words. Finally, she said, regret doesn't fix what's broken, but it's a start. The rest is up to you. Before he could respond, a young woman approached Margaret with a clipboard, gesturing toward a group of visitors waiting for a tour. Margaret excused herself, leaving Richard standing alone in the gallery. As Richard stepped back into the crisp autumn air, he realized that Margaret had truly moved on, and it was time for him to do the same. He couldn't rewrite the past, but he could try to live the rest of his life with integrity, even if it meant doing so alone. For Margaret, the encounter left her with a sense of closure she hadn't expected. That evening, she sat in her studio, working on a new painting. It was a sweeping landscape, vibrant and alive, filled with endless possibilities. It was a reflection of her life now, a canvas she was finally painting on her own terms. In the years that followed, the tangled lives of Margaret, Richard, and everyone caught in their orbit unraveled into distinct, separate paths. Time dulled the sharp edges of betrayal, but the marks it left behind shaped the course of their futures. Margaret embraced her independence fully. Her gallery expanded, becoming a hub for emerging artists and a beacon of creativity in the community. She found herself mentoring others, often sharing her story, not for sympathy, but as a testament to resilience and reinvention. Her children remained her closest confidants, their bond strengthened by the shared experience of rebuilding their lives. One summer, while hosting a local art workshop, Margaret met Daniel, a retired professor with a penchant for literature and travel. Unlike Richard, Daniel's presence was quiet and steady, his admiration for Margaret's work and strength genuine. They began a slow, tender romance built on mutual respect. It wasn't about filling a void, but about exploring what was possible when two people met as equals. For Richard, life became an ongoing exercise in self-reflection. His visits with Emily grew more meaningful as she matured into a thoughtful, curious teenager. She began asking questions about her family, her half-siblings, and the choices that had shaped her world. Richard answered as honestly as he could, determined to give her the clarity he had denied his own children. His relationship with Emma and Lucas, however, remained strained. Lucas occasionally reached out, his conversations polite but distant, while Emma maintained a wall of silence. Richard tried to respect their boundaries, sending cards on birthdays and holidays with no expectation of a response. It was a quiet penance for the pain he had caused. One day, during a routine visit to Emily's school recital, Richard was startled to see Lucas in the audience. Emily had invited him, unaware of the underlying tensions. The brothers exchanged awkward pleasantries, but as the evening progressed, they found themselves talking. It was stilted at first, but when the conversation turned to Emily and her aspirations, there was a flicker of connection. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step. Lisa had also undergone a transformation. After the scandal, she left the hospital to avoid the whispers and side glances. She pursued a career in community health, finding fulfillment in advocating for underserved families. Emily's well-being remained her priority, and she worked tirelessly to provide a stable home. Lisa and Margaret's paths crossed occasionally, at school functions or community events, and their interactions were polite but distant. The unspoken understanding between them was enough. Their lives, though once intertwined, were now on separate trajectories. Years later, during a sunny afternoon at Margaret's gallery, a young woman approached her with a shy smile. It was Emily, now in her 20s and brimming with confidence. "Hi, Mrs. Evans," she said, her voice carrying a blend of nervousness and determination. "I don't know if you remember me." Margaret smiled warmly. "Of course I do. You've grown up." Emily hesitated, then said, "I wanted to thank you for being strong, for showing me and everyone that it's possible to come out of something terrible and build something beautiful. My dad, he's told me a lot about you. I think he's finally starting to get it. Margaret's heart softened. It's kind of you to say that, Emily. I'm glad you came. As Emily walked away, Margaret felt an unexpected sense of peace. Her past had come full circle, not as a perfect resolution, but as an affirmation that growth and healing were possible, even in the aftermath of betrayal. Margaret returned to her studio that evening, her canvas waiting. For the first time in a long while, she painted without thinking of the past, only of the vibrant, untamed future that lay ahead. Years passed, and the lives of Margaret, Richard, and those connected to their tangled history continued to evolve. The ripples of their choices were still felt, but time softened the edges, allowing new chapters to take root. Margaret, now in her late 60s, stood in her gallery, a glass of champagne in hand, as she hosted an exhibition celebrating a decade of her artistic journey. The room was filled with friends, family, and admirers of her work. Each painting on display told a story, not of pain, but of triumph, resilience, and the beauty of starting anew. Her partner, Daniel, stood beside her, his arm around her waist as he listened to her recount the story of her latest piece to a captivated audience. Margaret had found not just love but a steady companionship that honored her independence and creativity. Emma, now married with a child of her own, mingled nearby with Lucas, who had recently started a nonprofit focused on mental health. The siblings had grown closer over the years, bound by their shared experiences and the unshakable bond with their mother. Richard, meanwhile, was living a quieter life in the countryside. He had purchased a small house with a sprawling garden that he tended to with the meticulous care he once reserved for his patients. Gardening became a source of therapy, a way to nurture life, even as he wrestled with the shadows of his past. His relationship with Emily deepened as she entered adulthood. She often visited him, bringing stories of her college experiences and dreams for the future. Richard reveled in her company, cherishing the opportunity to be present for her in a way he hadn't been for his other children. One summer afternoon, Emily suggested a family meeting. "I think it's time, Dad," she said gently. "You've avoided Emma and Lucas for long enough. I know it's hard, but they deserve to hear from you, even if it's just an apology." Richard hesitated but knew she was right. With Emily's encouragement, he reached out to his older children. After several tentative exchanges, they agreed to meet at a neutral location, a quiet cafe in the city. The meeting was tense at first, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. Richard looked at Emma and Lucas, now fully grown, and felt an overwhelming mix of pride and regret. "I know I don't deserve this," he began, his voice trembling, "but I'm grateful you agreed to meet. I want to say, I'm sorry for everything, for the lies, the betrayal, the hurt I caused all of you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say it." Emma's expression was unreadable, her arms crossed defensively. Lucas, ever the mediator, broke the silence. "It's good to hear you say that, Dad, but words can only go so far." Emma finally spoke, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "You didn't just hurt Mom, you hurt us too. You tore apart everything we thought we knew about our family." "I know," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I'll carry that for the rest of my life. But I want you to know, I'm trying to be better, for Emily, and for myself. I'd like the chance to rebuild something with you, even if it's just a small part." The conversation that followed was difficult, but for the first time it felt honest. By the end, there were no hugs or declarations of forgiveness, but there was a sliver of understanding, a fragile foundation on which to build. In the following months, Richard made slow but steady progress with Emma and Lucas. It wasn't a return to the closeness they had once shared, but it was a start. They began exchanging occasional messages and sharing updates, a small but significant step toward reconciliation. As for Margaret, her life continued to flourish. She remained a pillar of strength and creativity in her community, her story inspiring others to embrace change and resilience. One evening, as she sat in her garden with Daniel, watching the sun set over the horizon, She reflected on her journey. "I never thought life would look like this," she said, smiling. "But I'm glad it does." Daniel squeezed her hand. "You made it this way, and it's beautiful." Margaret nodded, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. The past was a part of her, but it no longer defined her. Her life was her own masterpiece. Imperfect, vibrant, and endlessly evolving. Several more years slipped by, weaving the threads of Margaret, Richard, and their families into a tapestry of healing, change, and the quiet acceptance of life's imperfections. Time, as always, was the great equalizer, softening wounds, offering new beginnings, and ensuring that the past found its proper place. Behind them, Margaret celebrated her 70th birthday with an intimate gathering at her gallery. Friends, family, and colleagues filled the space, their laughter echoing among the vibrant canvases. Emma and Lucas had organized the event, surprising their mother with heartfelt speeches and a slideshow of memories spanning her remarkable journey. As Margaret looked around the room, she spotted Emily standing near the back. Now a poised and confident young woman, Emily had come alone, an olive branch extended on behalf of her father. Margaret walked over, her smile warm and genuine. "You've grown into an incredible young woman," Margaret said, hugging Emily lightly. "I've had good examples to follow," Emily replied, her voice tinged with admiration. "My dad always tells me how much he respects you. Even now, I just wanted to say thank you for being kind to me when you didn't have to be." Margaret's eyes softened. "You didn't ask for any of this, Emily. You deserved kindness and the chance to grow without carrying the weight of someone else's mistakes." Emily nodded, a flicker of gratitude in her expression. "He's different now, better. I think losing everything made him realize what really matters." Margaret considered this for a moment. "I hope so, for his sake, and for yours." Meanwhile, Richard's life in the countryside had settled into a quiet rhythm of contentment. Though he would never fully regain the closeness he once shared with Emma and Lucas, their occasional visits and phone calls had become a source of comfort. They had reached an understanding. While the wounds might never fully heal, there was room for cautious connection. One crisp autumn morning, Richard received an unexpected visitor, Lucas. He arrived unannounced, carrying a small box and wearing an expression of guarded determination. Richard welcomed him with surprise, leading him to the sunlit garden he had cultivated over the years. "I thought you might like this," Lucas said, handing over the box. Inside was a collection of old family photos, vacations, birthdays, and candid moments Richard hadn't seen in years. "I found these while cleaning out some things," Lucas explained. "I wasn't sure if I wanted to bring them, but I figured they belonged to you too." Richard's throat tightened as he sifted through the images, each one a reminder of the life he had lost and the people he had let down. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "This means more than I can say." Lucas nodded, his expression softening. "We're not there yet, Dad, but we're getting closer." Margaret, now fully immersed in her role as a mentor and community leader, found new joy in the unexpected. She and Daniel embarked on a series of trips across Europe and Asia, her sketchbook always in hand, capturing scenes that would later inspire her art. She gave lectures on resilience and creativity, her story touching audiences far and wide. One day, while browsing a quaint bookstore in Paris, Margaret stumbled upon a journal with an embossed cover. Inside, she began jotting down her thoughts, not about the past, but about the life she was building now. Her entries, filled with gratitude and dreams for the future, would one day form the basis of her memoir, A Life Rewritten. The book became a bestseller, not because it was scandalous but because it was honest, inspiring others to embrace change and find strength in their struggles. At the book's launch event, Margaret stood before a crowd of supporters, her children and Daniel in the front row. "My story isn't extraordinary," she said. "It's human. We all face moments that test us, that break us, but we're not defined by those moments. We're defined by what we do after." The applause was thunderous, but Margaret's focus remained on the people who mattered most. Emma, Lucas, and even Emily, who had joined them, smiled up at her, their pride and love palpable. As the sun set on that chapter of her life, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. She had taken the wreckage of a broken life and built something beautiful. And though the scars remained, they were no longer sources of pain. They were reminders of her strength, a strength that carried her forward, always toward the light. Years later, the threads of Margaret's story wove themselves into a final, lasting picture, a testament to love, forgiveness, and the inevitability of change. The lives she touched, the choices she made, and the resilience she embodied became a legacy far greater than the pain she had endured. Margaret's health began to decline as she approached her 80th year. Her once vivid paintings slowed, her hands less steady, but her mind remained sharp and vibrant. She continued to write, reflecting on her journey with a mix of gratitude and wisdom. By then, her memoir had become a staple on bookshelves worldwide, inspiring countless readers to face their challenges with courage. On a quiet spring afternoon, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and Daniel, Margaret sat in her garden. The flowers she had planted years ago were in full bloom, their colors vibrant and alive. Emma and Lucas tended to her with care, while Emily, now a successful physician, recounted stories of her own patience and the lessons she had learned from her father and Margaret. Richard, too, had found a measure of peace. Though he and Margaret had never reconciled romantically, they had come to share a mutual respect, a quiet acknowledgement of their intertwined lives. He often visited her in her final years, their conversations light but meaningful. They no longer spoke of the past but focused on the present, each finding comfort in the other's company. One such visit occurred on a warm evening just weeks before Margaret's passing. Richard sat beside her in the garden, the two of them watching the setting sun. "You've done well," Richard said, his voice soft. "Better than I ever could have imagined." Margaret smiled faintly. "I did what I had to do, Richard, and so did you in your own way. We can't change what's behind us, but we've done our best with what's ahead." Richard nodded, the silence between them peaceful. For the first time in decades, they simply existed together, no bitterness, no anger, just two people who had lived and learned. Margaret passed away quietly in her sleep not long after, surrounded by the people who loved her. Her funeral was a celebration of her life, filled with laughter, tears, and the stories of how she had inspired others. Richard attended, standing quietly at the back of the service. As he watched Emma, Lucas, and Emily speak about the woman who had shaped them, he felt a deep gratitude for Margaret's forgiveness, for her strength, and for the way she had helped him become a better man in the end. Margaret's legacy lived on in the lives she touched. Her children carried forward her values of honesty, resilience, and love. Her art adorned walls around the world, a permanent reminder of her story. And her memoir continued to inspire new generations to face life's trials with grace. In the end, Margaret's life was not defined by betrayal or pain, but by what came after. It was a life of rebuilding, of embracing imperfection, and of choosing love, again and again, no matter the cost. It was a life well lived, a masterpiece in every sense.